Hello, and welcome to this virtual program on Human Rights Day. We will be exploring pathways to justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. These are lessons we've learned from the front lines. I'm Elaine Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Conflict-related sexual violence is a global scourge. It's taking a terrible toll on survivors from the DRC and Ukraine, and from Sudan to Haiti, and so many other places around the globe. In fact, according to the most recent UN reports, it is growing worse by the day. Moreover, despite its being a violation of human rights law, a threat to peace and security, it continues with impunity. Perpetrators are rarely held accountable, and there's little justice for survivors. A few months ago, we came together in Poland with women activists who are working often against great odds to achieve justice for survivors in Ukraine, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Colombia. They drew from their experiences across conflicts to discuss lessons learned for addressing this very difficult issue. They provided valuable insights for accountability and for actions to meet the needs of survivors. And you will shortly hear from 4 of them. Today, we are also releasing an important new report on this topic, Pathways to Justice and Accountability for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. But before we turn to the discussion, a few logistical notes. We are joined by an audience of several hundred attendees. Many are representatives of governments, multilateral organizations, and NGOs, and we welcome each and every one of you. Some of you have already submitted questions when you registered. You also have the opportunity to submit questions throughout this broadcast. Use your Q&A feature on your computer, note your name, your affiliation, and to whom you are directing the question. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Axel Dietmann, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Washington. We are very grateful to the Embassy for supporting this report and to Germany for its leadership on this issue and their feminist foreign policy. Mr. Dietmann brings considerable diplomatic experience to this issue, having served in missions to the EU, as ambassador to Serbia, and in several important positions relating to the Western Balkans, and so much more throughout his distinguished diplomatic career. Mr. Dietmann, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. And dear panelists and dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is really a pleasure for us to participate in this panel this morning, me and my colleague, Elisabeth Franz. Today is the anniversary of one of the world's most groundbreaking global pledges, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed equal rights for every human being. But if we look at actual conflicts, women and marginalized groups are often still profoundly affected by them, and sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war. The UN Secretary General report on conflict-related sexual violence reported a total of 3,622 UN-verified cases and highlights that women and girls are disproportionately affected, accounting for more than 95% of cases. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has documented 376 cases of conflict-related gender-based violence, and the number of unreported cases is likely to be much higher. If women are not safe, then no one is safe. A Ukrainian woman said this to German Minister of Foreign Affairs Annalena Baerbock in early 2022, when they were standing together near the contact line in the east of Ukraine before Russia's brutal war of aggression started on February 24, 2022. This quote marks the opening remarks of Germany's Federal Foreign Office guidelines shaping feminist foreign policy. Combating sexual and gender-based violence in armed conflict, supporting the survivors of violent crimes, and bringing the perpetrators to justice, these goals are an integral part of Germany's feminist foreign policy. We have supported many initiatives and projects to translate these goals into practice. Just to name a few, Germany introduced the prosecution and punishment of sexualized violence within the framework of the ICC and the Rome Statute, and used the ICC Assembly of State Parties to address the prohibition of conflict-related gender-based violence under international criminal law. We also put a focus on sexualized violence in the framework of Germany's voluntary contribution to the ICC on the Ukraine Trust Fund. It supported the Alliance of Civil Society and Organizations of Tigray to establish a zero-tolerance policy on gender-based violence, and we promoted OSCE training for judges on dealing with conflict-related gender-based violence. Ladies and gentlemen, here in DC, as part of our feminist foreign policy, we are very glad that we could support the project of your institute, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, that has led to the release today of the report you alluded to, Pathways to Justice and Accountability for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. As you mentioned, based on the workshop with participants from Ukraine, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Colombia, shared lessons learned for responding to conflict-related gender-based violence. This report offers policy recommendations for the international community and key stakeholders to hold perpetrators accountable, to meet survivor needs, and to follow through on their commitments to deliver justice. And as you said, I can fully support and say that the recommendation to address conflict-related gender-based violence are so important right now, because the world is really facing a very high number of conflicts. And as you mentioned, Ukraine, Sudan, Haiti, and in most of these conflicts, conflict-related gender-based violence does play an important role, unfortunately. I would like to finally just make one other point looking at conflict-related gender-based violence, and that is the importance of preventing conflicts. Next year marks the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, WPS agenda, confirmed for the first time that the importance of the involvement of women in creating and preserving peace. Conflict prevention, peace processes, and post-conflict peace building were acknowledged as women's and therefore human rights. And for the first time, sexual and gender-based violence was not considered to be an unavoidable side effect of war, but a crime that must be systematically prevented and punished. And also, in the aftermath of the conflict, data has proven that when women have a strong influence on the negotiating process for peace agreements, there's a much higher chance that an agreement will be reached, and it is much more likely that a peace agreement will be lasting. Therefore, Germany is committed to strengthening women's role in peace processes and making these processes inclusive. The ambassador, dear participants, at the outset, I made reference to this quote: "If women are not safe, then no one is safe." And I would like to formulate it in a broader manner. When women are safe, all of us are safer. And therefore, I want to thank the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and the leaders who took part in the formulation of the important report, and who are also taking part in the panel today. And I will I hope that you will have a intense and fruitful discussion. And thank you so much for letting us participate in this meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, sir, and to your government. It's especially gratifying to see Germany leading in this space in a very significant way. And thank you for mentioning the importance of the framework on women, peace, and security. And one of the key pillars of that framework, we all know, is protection. And this issue looms large in the fact that we need to do a great deal more than the world is doing to address it. So we will begin our discussion here, and thank you for setting the stage. It's an excellent overview to get us started. I'm going to turn now to Jess Keller, the author of our conflict-related sexual violence report, to present its key findings. Jess is an alumna of our Georgetown Institute and a recent graduate of advanced studies at Oxford University. Jess, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you to the distinguished panelists and guests who have joined today. As we know, this year marked the 15th anniversary of the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1888, which first recognized conflict-related sexual violence as a grave threat to international peace and security and called for concrete action to address it. Yet we see 15 years on, the gap between these commitments and action remains stark. Across the globe, CRSV continues to be used as a weapon of war. And in too many cases, impunity remains the norm rather than the exception. And so for survivors, the barriers to justice and healing are often overwhelming. We know that an estimated 80% of cases go unreported, and much of this is due to the entrenched shame and stigma that discourage survivors from speaking out. They also face challenges accessing life-saving medical and mental health services, and these barriers are especially heightened for those who have fled their homes or who remain in occupied territories where aid providers often face limited or no access. And given the breakdown of national justice capacities during wartime and other barriers to gathering reliable evidence, perpetrators are rarely held accountable. But at the same time, we also see that women in civil society organizations are on the front lines of these documentation and service provision efforts. So as we will hear in the panel, NGOs in the Balkans were critical to providing holistic support and legal advocacy both during and after conflict. We see survivors in Colombia who were instrumental in influencing the peace negotiations to prohibit amnesty for sexual violence crimes. And then today we see organizations like the Center for Civil Liberties and the SEMA Network in Ukraine who are undertaking Herculean efforts to document atrocities during war. So amid the failures of the international community to hold perpetrators accountable, we also see so many cases of best practice. And this is why our team at Georgetown, as Ambassador Verveer alluded to, brought together a cohort of women from across these conflict settings to understand the nature of the challenges, to identify key priorities and needs, and also to share lessons learned. And so we recognize that no two conflicts are the same, but that learning from what worked, and also importantly, what didn't work, is essential to addressing knowledge gaps and supporting ongoing efforts. So overall, this report draws on their insights to identify 5 priority areas for action. And to give a quick overview, first, survivors need immediate, accessible, and holistic support, which includes healthcare, legal aid, and psychosocial services that are tailored to their unique needs. So we see innovative initiatives like one-stop relief centers, national hotlines, and digital chat boxes that are really expanding avenues for reporting and helping to deliver safe and confidential care. Second, survivors must be at the forefront of evidence collection and documentation efforts. So documenting sexual violence crimes is really important for creating this historical record that can be used for future accountability processes and for securing reparations. And these standardized documentation procedures should be created in partnership with survivors. They should prioritize data security and confidentiality, and they should adhere to trauma-informed principles. Third, addressing stigma is essential for long-term recovery. We uncovered innovative initiatives that have challenged harmful norms across conflicts, from partnering with trusted religious and traditional leaders to amplifying the voices of survivors through public awareness and media campaigns that can help to break the silence around these issues. Fourth, perpetrators and enablers must be held accountable for their crimes. This can range from national and international prosecutions to even utilizing sanctions regimes to publicly and clearly condemn human rights violators. And this should be central to any peace or transitional justice process. And then fifth, urgent and comprehensive reparations are crucial to provide support, recognition, and compensation to survivors. So as we learned from the wars in the Balkans, legal recognition as civilian victims of war is essential, including for children born of wartime rape. Just a few weeks ago, the Ukrainian parliament adopted historic new legislation which recognized survivors as victims entitled to these reparations. And so this is critical to their recovery and can have a generational impact. So overall, this report offers lessons learned and actionable steps to dismantle the culture of impunity, to center survivors in decision-making, and also to ensure that justice is not just a promise, but a reality. So we hope this can be a really useful resource for policymakers, practitioners, and other stakeholders who are working on these issues. And I look forward to hearing more insights from my fellow panelists from their own countries and their experiences. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jess. And let's do that exactly as you stated. We'll turn now to our panelists to learn from each of you what you have been up against and how you have overcome in so many ways in your experiences. We'll start with Alisa Kovalenko. She is a member of Sema Ukraine Network, the first Ukrainian NGO organization of women survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence during the Russian invasion of Ukraine starting in 2014. She's also an award-winning film director based in Kiev, and we look forward to the future release of her film, The Voices of the Survivors. And at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, she joined a volunteer combat unit associated with the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Alisa, we're so happy to have you with us today, and welcome. The situation in Ukraine, as we all know, is devastating in so many ways. But it also is devastating because there are so many reports of sexual violence being perpetrated by the Russian forces. How are survivors being supported? How are these crimes being documented, which is critically important to future accountability? And how are you overcoming the barriers that are clearly there and dealing effectively with this tremendous problem?
Thank you, dear Ambassador. First, I want to say that when we are talking about conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, we are mostly talking about full-scale invasion, but actually it started since 2014 when Russia invaded Donbass, and I was a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence in 2014. And actually, I was the first woman who reported and who gave a testimony about what happened. Now we have much more testimonies, and also thanks to our work, what we, Sema Ukraine, did. I want to concentrate now more on one very important thing. We started to make some activities which we called lecture of raise awareness in communities on the occupied territories. Because mainly women who are living in small communities, they're very afraid to testify. Also, they're afraid that people will judge them. I know one example when a woman committed suicide because she felt judgment from people from her village. And what we started to do 4 months ago, we traveled to small villages and towns on the occupied territories, and we talk with women and with people from communities just to explain what is it, conflict-related sexual violence. And that it's also war crime, that it's crime against humanity. We talk about justice, justice on an international level, justice on a national level, where these women can go to testify, why it's important to testify. It's all sounds so obvious for us now when we talk, but it's not so obvious for women in small communities. So it's very important to build this dialogue. And what is a big problem in Ukraine that, and what I felt that for all these years, actually, not only after full-scale invasion, because suddenly everybody woke up and started to talk about these crimes. Before, it didn't exist in our society, and for our government, it didn't exist as well. We didn't have any status, and like nobody were interested in us. But now what's important is to build proper communication and to talk also with people in small communities in regions. Because also in this kind of complicated areas, which is close to front line, there are not enough professionals and police or prosecutors who can work with survivors. And it's a big problem. Also, I did first identifying survivors, but second also to take testimonies in this empathic, human-oriented way. I've heard from one of woman member of Sema-Ukraine that when she gave testimonies about what happened to her, she was raped and tortured. Police officer asked her, but why you want to testify about sexual violence? Anyway, we will not find the perpetrator. And this tells us about this very low level of people who are working in these institutions like lower enforcement. And it's a big problem, because how we can identify, how we can work, how we can make quality reports about this if we have such a bad level of officers who are like investigating these crimes. And we try to also talk to women and to other people in communities in the occupied territories, that actually your testimony is also your weapon against perpetrator. We don't know when justice will come, but at least this is the first step to justice. And what Jess mentioned about this reparations, that actually Ukraine became a first country and history of the world who actually developed a mechanism of paying interim reparation during ongoing war. And it also helping to identify crimes of conflict sexual violence, because people who don't trust police or prosecutor office, when they see that there is alternative procedure to give a testimony, they become more open to talk about what happened to them. And I think this mechanism can help to have much more people talk openly about what happened to them.
Thank you so much. And that powerful statement you made, your testimony is a weapon against the perpetrators. That must be so energizing in some ways to the survivors who've suffered so much and are still enduring trauma. And also very interesting about the interim reparations during wartime. So maybe we can talk some more about that as we go forward. But next, we're going to turn to Dr. Feride Rushiti. She is the founder and director of the Kosovo Rehabilitation Center for Torture Victims. For almost 2 decades in research and advocacy, she has secured access to healthcare and justice for survivors, which, as we all know, is so critically important. Her advocacy helped make possible the landmark government decision in Kosovo to fund pensions for the survivors of the wartime sexual violence there. So Faraday, welcome to you. We're looking forward to hearing about your experiences. Your work at the center has pioneered a very survivor-centered approach to services and to recovery efforts. Tell us about that work, and also what we, because there are so many places struggling with this horrific reality, what civil society can do in providing services during wartime, what we can do to support that work better than we are doing. Can you unmute?
Good morning, Ambassador Riviere, distinguished panelists, dear guests, Mr. Dittman, and all you present today. First of all, it's my great pleasure to be today within a Human Rights Day to discuss about lesson learned of Kosovo, as well as to see how we can support ourselves in this struggle, because unfortunately, even today when we are discussing sexual violence as a weapon of the war, is attacking women and girls as a part of the battlefield. I am honored to be part of this discussion, which shine a much needed spotlight on the needs and the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. As a founder and leader of Kosovo Rehabilitation Center for Torture Victims, I have witnessed both the profound suffering caused by conflict-related sexual violence, but also, I have to say, incredible strength and resilience that survivors shows. More than 25 years, I am committed to advocate for their rights and ensure that they receive adequate care and dignity treatment they deserve. Of course, it's quite complicated field, which even though we are fighting in daily basis, even we are working with survivors, still there is a lot to be done in this field. At KRCT, as an organization, we develop holistic care with a survivor-centric approach, which means providing direct service, psychosocial, medical, legal, and economical empowerment. But those kind of service, what I learned on those 25 years, they have to be continuous, because sometimes survivors of sexual violence are coming in our organization for a certain period of time, and later on, they just disappear. But since conflict-related sexual violence is not an isolated act, it's not opportunity, it is part of the arsenal of the war, and those women are not impacted only by themselves as individuals, but also families impacted. They come in organization after 3 years, 4 years. So therefore, as an advocate in this field, I strongly support long-term intervention with conflict-related sexual violence, because just one period of time to support them in terms of empowering them psychologically is not enough. Secondly, in those 25 years, I think it is so important to work parallel to comprehensive support, providing direct service. Also to address stigma which surrounding them, stigma and shame. We learn that providing care is not just about addressing physical or psychological wounds, it's about creating space where survival feels safe and supported. So through ensuring continuous psychological support, we enable them to be treated their consequences in peace with a permanent counseling support and psychotherapy that acknowledge their unique experience. I heard Jesse very well how she addressed unique experience, because in those 25 years, I think we have to admit that there is heterogeneous group, the group of survivors of sexual violence. Each and every one, they need their tailored intervention approach. In KRCT, we have survivors who are coming just for psychosocial support. We have survivors who are coming just for advocacy purpose. We have survivors who are engaged in economical empowerment program. And we have 2 survivors who become worldwide advocate and part of SEMA, part of IRCT. So each and everyone have unique experience, and we have to work on hidden talents, because those survivors, before they went through this torture and rape, they had the identity, they have the education. We have to work. There are some survivors who really could be a great advocate, and we have to tailor this kind of talent they have in order to be able to use them as an advocate in national level, but also internationally, as I heard also Alicia is doing very well in Ukraine with SEMA network. Besides working on addressing stigma and shame, I think it is so important to work with medical and paramedic professionals. Why? Because in our situation, due to the stigma and tragedies around this crime, when survivors went to the primary health sector as a first door to have some kind of medical check, doctors were not prepared, and nurses how to identify signs, how to work with them, how to listen to them. So it is so important that the training and trauma-informed approach, not only informed approach, but also acting approach, to be also part of the curriculum of medical professionals and nursing, because they are kind of first gate that sometimes as an NGO we are not reaching far or in remote areas. So if we have integrated curriculum on the medical professionals and nurses, we enlarge our scope of network beyond the NGOs and beyond the communities we are working. Another intervention which I would like also to address in terms of addressing stigma. When we are discussing how to address stigma, and it is really admiring to hear that already in Ukraine they had it very strong message, testimony of survivors, a weapon against the enemy. I think we have to create such an awareness-raising campaign which is treating them with dignity and empowering them in the process. In Kosovo, we had a 2 national campaign, Hear My Voice and Be My Voice, and later one, Be My Face. The idea it was just to integrate whole communities supporting us in this field, because it's such a big pain in our society, and it's not so easy to bring in surface, to treat it in adequate manner with a dignity. So we had it to involve community leaders, religious figures, youth, human rights activists, and survivors who stand for themselves in order to break down the barriers and toxic masculinity and patriarchal norm that exists in our society. In society, when the honor is evaluated based on sexuality of the woman, it's not so easy to discuss for such a topic. Therefore, I heard also the reaction and behavior of the policemen in Ukraine. It is so important to create a safety net with a lot of activists from community level to the institutional level. Besides that, in Kosovo, as an organization, we had to work more than 15, besides providing service, working on advocacy, raising awareness, our organization also have as a crucial element advocacy action, and advocacy action led us to finally, after 15 years of the war in 2040, survivors to be recognized by law and to have administrative reparation. I just shared it before we start this meeting. Also last week, we reached to also amend the law, and we reached to ensure free public health service, primary, secondary, and tertiary for survivors, which was not ensured 25 years later. So advocacy work have to be an integrated part of all those movements. Why? Because while we are working with the story of a survivor, we engage them to be activists in our field. It is so important to address the needs through the advocacy action, either changing the laws, either promoting affirmative policies in order their rights to be adequately treated, but as well as all the needs they are coming by years to be addressed either in state policies or in laws. One other element what I would like to mention is documentation. When we are discussing for documentation, I have to say that In Kosovo, after the war, we were not aware that documentation needs to be integrated part of our work. Because in that period of time, in 1999, 1998, 2000, also we had a lack of resource, lack of capacity. Whole Kosovo had it only 2 clinical psychologists. One of them worked with us. So awareness on documentation and collecting data and testimony was not present in our work. Therefore, we established in 2009 a comprehensive documentation with a focus on survivors' needs as our key achieved for survivors, but as well as based on principle of do not harm, and we try to integrate Nadia's Murad Code. When we are discussing for comprehensive documentation, I think it is so important now in Ukraine, but also in other countries when unfortunately this weapon of the war is integrated arsenal of the war, to have appropriate documentation when testimonies and all information and needs of survivors to be addressed with idea that through having comprehensive documentation, later on, we could initiate either program, psychosocial program, which have to be in place, either access to justice, either reparation, to change laws and policies, to work on transitional justice, but as well as in prevention. So in this perspective, we learned later on, we came in this, we achieved to make documentation 20 years later, which I have to say, some of the survivors are not with us anymore. They were unable to testify and have the ID in this documentation. But for the countries that still are struggling and facing, we believe that parallel with holistic intervention, addressing stigma surrounding this crime, they need to establish proper documentation with a focus on survivors' needs in order later on to serve as a grant for all policy development, law amendments, and other requests that survivors bring. On 25 years, I have to say that we have also, as organization, to research a long-term impact of conflict-related sexual violence. And we have to bear in mind that, unfortunately, this burden of the war is not only represented to the primary victims or survivors, but we saw it also as a part of intergeneration trauma. Even young children who were not facing at all war, unfortunately, due to the trauma that their mother were impacted, they might develop similar symptoms, either emotionally, either in terms of mental, physical, and social. So we have to work also with intergeneration trauma, especially in those areas when conflict is remaining open. So if we do not work with intergeneration trauma, I think it is quite dangerous for new generation that they are facing without not dealt properly with the trauma, and then the idea of being conflict societies, it's present in society. So this is from my perspective, and as well as we have also to analyze the dynamic in the family, I have to say, Ambassador Vivier, because we see in the most of the family who went through this crime during the war, we see a lot of domestic violence. And women, they are during the wartime, they were raped, but also consequences of domestic violence is avoiding them to reach certain opportunity in their lives to be integrated in societies. So domestic violence have to be also as a research based with idea to have proper intervention.
So much, Ferida. You touched on so many important topics. I think for the survivor-centered work, that it be a continuum, that it can't be short-term. It's got to continue in a long-term way for the survivors' benefit. The importance of informed healthcare workers, empowerment to the survivors through a community process, advocacy, documentation, research. So much goes into this. And I think your description is vitally important in terms of a greater understanding of what needs to be done. And you're talking about a war that ended 2.5 decades ago, and yet this work is as important today, still in addressing it. Thank you. So we're going to turn now to Adriana Hanjušić, who is a Bosnian human rights lawyer and activist. She's engaged in CRSV documentation and helped advance transitional justice. She's been active as a senior legal advisor at Trial International, an NGO that fights impunity for international crimes, and she's represented victims of war crimes, particularly victims of conflict-related sexual violence, who are seeking access to justice and to reparations. And today she is working in these processes in Ukraine through Vital Voices. So Adriana, welcome to you as well. And perhaps you can share with us effective strategies in the Bosnian context for ensuring redress and accountability. As we've heard over and over today, accountability is still very elusive, and impunity, for the most part, still reigns. How were witnesses and survivors supported in the Bosnian context? What were some of the barriers you had to confront, and was it possible to overcome them?
Thank you very much for this introduction, Ambassador Verveer. I wish, first of all, to congratulate you and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security on this important report. And I also wish to thank you for inviting me to share insights from the Bosnian experience at this significant event on this important date. Bosnia and Herzegovina, where more than 20,000 individuals were subjected to sexual violence during the 4-year-long war, is among the countries with a solid record of CRSV prosecutions. And it is often cited as an example to be followed from an external perspective, which is based on the comparative grim perspective. But achieving this progress took a long time and required a combination of many different measures, both at the international and at the domestic level. Efforts were made to align domestic definitions of sexual violence and criminal procedural provisions with international standards. Continuous specialized training for various professionals was essential, covering best international practices, the unique nature of CRSV crimes, and the importance of using trauma-informed and survivor-centered approaches to their work. Comprehensive support systems of special protection measures were developed, creating a safer space for victims to participate in prosecutions. Witness support mechanisms within prosecuting institutions were established. Apart from that, the establishment of referral mechanisms and closer cooperation between institutions and civil society organizations proved crucial in providing a holistic response to victims' needs and rights. But having said all of this, when speaking with survivors in Bosnia, one is constantly confronted with a prevailing sentiment that can be described as too little, too late. Precious time has indeed been lost during this process due to factors ranging from organizational challenges to political challenges. And as a result, many perpetrators became unavailable. In addition, victims have become increasingly reluctant to testify. Many victims have been asked countless times to tell their stories, only to have their expectations repeatedly raised and then disappointed. In this regard, a significant failure has been the lack of proper expectations management within the community of victims, but also the society as a whole. But even when cases finally reach the courtrooms, we quickly realize that in order to provide victims with this cathartic moment they have longed for, punishment in itself is not enough. The prison sentences must be proportional to the severity of the crime committed and the harm caused, which all too often is not the case for CRSV crimes, regarded as a lesser crime. Stigmatizing remarks, attitudes, and actions present throughout criminal proceedings based on rape myths must be addressed. But most importantly, to make this a transformative, a healing experience, we must strive to put the survivor at the center of criminal proceedings. It is very important to not let them feel just like a passive, simple evidence tool, but really to provide them with opportunities to take an active role in the process. To make this happen, we at my former NGO Trial International had organized a creative advocacy strategy that led to a major breakthrough in 2015, when for the first time in the Western Balkans, a victim of war crimes, a CRSV survivor, was awarded compensation in criminal proceedings. Since then, it has become common practice in Bosnia and Herzegovina to award compensation claims to CRSV survivors alongside prison sentences. Later, we ensured also the establishment of an obligation for the Ministry of Justice to provide legal representation to gender-based violence survivors. And slowly, a change in atmosphere could be felt amongst those survivors supported under these new circumstances. Before and during the proceedings, they felt that special attention was being given by various actors involved to their needs and the harm they had suffered. Returning to your question, Ambassador, about effective strategies for ensuring some of those positive changes that I mentioned, it required continuous and dedicated action, as mentioned by Faride, by empowered CSOs aimed at aligning domestic realities with international standards. This action was also enabled by the increasing attention from the international community, which provided political and technical support and resources to both CSOs and domestic authorities. A crucial factor for enabling change were multifaceted advocacy strategies, which included running awareness-raising campaigns, continuous training, sensitizing about the challenges CRSV survivors face, producing manuals, studies, engaging in strategic human rights litigation, as well as, very important, identifying allies and cooperating with those allies within various institutions. Let me conclude with one essential lesson learned. We must be mindful not to view justice in very narrow terms, neglecting various avenues for bringing a sense of satisfaction to victims. For justice to be truly fulfilled, it is important for survivors that once judicial facts about crimes are established, they are not denied, and that war criminals are not glorified, which happens all too often in Bosnia. Survivors also need broader recognition and condemnation of what happened in their communities. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, as it was mentioned, recognizing the legal status of civilian victims of war was important. First of all, it happened in 2007 for CRSV survivors, and then in 2022 for children born of wartime rape. And those two examples were among the world's firsts. And this recognition brought immense satisfaction to survivors and their children and their families. First of all, on a symbolic level, just a symbolic level of being recognized, acknowledged as a civilian victim of war, but also, of course, for the supportive reparation measures linked to such a status. The perception of justice is highly individualized, as we have heard before. Criminal justice, as well as effective outreach about its outcomes, reparation measures, acknowledgement, and memorialization efforts are all elements different survivors perceive as something that they deserve and they need. Therefore, these should all serve as guiding principles for a comprehensive approach to the work of various actors with CRSV survivors. The initial crucial step in this process, as we have also learned through the report, as you will be able, who are following this webinar, to read it, is if we wish to make it survivor-centered, to listen attentively to the voices of survivors and allow them to guide us. I will stop here by thanking you for listening to my voice. I'm looking forward to the following discussion and to listening to the panelists.
Well, thank you, Adriana. I think your comments on comprehensive justice and what it represents is extremely important in expanding this discussion. And interesting that as we talk about survivor center, you're raising the need for the survivor to be at the center of the criminal proceedings as well, and to factor in all of the aspects that are attendant to that process. But especially saying too little, too late. That's what we hope we will address in many ways by this program, by recommendations, by your experiences, all of you, so that in Ukraine, for example, they can get ahead of this process and not be, in terms of helping the survivors and in terms of accountability for what the perpetrators have done. So not to repeat the past, but to really be learning from all of these experiences to address it in a more significant way. And finally, we're going to turn now to South America, to Susana Peralta Ramon. She is a lawyer and a scholar on Colombia's special jurisdiction for peace. She has been a longtime advocate for the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in transitional justice and peace building. Susana, we're happy to have you with us as well. Colombia's peace agreement is recognized around the world for being gender sensitive. It prohibits amnesty for crimes of sexual violence and the need to address them. Survivors had a voice in the process that adopted ultimately the agreement. How did the special jurisdiction for peace confront CRSV? What role did women play, especially survivors, in that whole process? And what can we learn about peace processes and this issue? Because all too often peace processes don't even consider CRSV and what's happened throughout the wars. So we're welcome you and eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to all of my wonderful colleagues. It's amazing to hear you again and to keep on learning from you. I'll try to keep it short because I know we're running a little bit late, but I do want to convey at least the two main lessons learned from the Colombian context. I think during the final peace accord that was reached just recently in 2016, the two main issues or the two most common dilemmas on gender-related issues that the Colombian context was able to dissolve were, first, either to specialize or to mainstream a gender approach or gender provisions in the instrument that is being drafted to address the end of conflict. Colombia learned, and it is now demonstrating that that dilemma doesn't make any sense. You have to have both. You have to have a specialized team of people that are professionals in gender issues, because this is also something that was common before the final peace accord came to life. It was common to see gender as a second class or a second category kind of knowledge. That is, of course, not true. It has decades of academic and professional history that must be addressed and taken into account in order to actually provide justice and reparations for survivors and societies overall. So first, you have to have this specialized team of professionals that are constantly updating their knowledge, both on the academic field, but most importantly, as Faride and Alisa were just saying, with survivors' claims and knowledge, because it is not the same when you're trying to judicialize a crime that was committed in the middle of the jungle where nobody was there and the weather conditions are very difficult and you have no hard evidence, and compared to a crime that was committed in the city where perhaps some audiovisual evidence has been gathered. It is not the same, and what victims want is also not always the same. So you have to have this specific team always on board and always gathering information from survivors and from what the specific academic knowledge production is making at the moment. And also you have to have institutions that are capable of implementing those recommendations. And this is where I think lessons from previous tribunals show us that that is what went wrong. What Adriana was just mentioning, for example, even if you have an amount of information that shows you how to do it or how to litigate a case, if you have a very specific and narrow-minded definition of justice or of violence or of harm, there is nothing any judge can do. So you have to have institutions, whether they are judicial or not, but you have to have institutions that are capable of receiving those recommendations and implementing them. So that is what the Special Jurisdiction for Peace was able to do by including this survivor-centered approach. So from the beginning on, what were the crimes that were going to be subjected to amnesty and those that weren't, survivors and their organizations had been involved in order to make that decision. So institutions are not just simply put there and then expected to address these long time subjected to impunity kind of crimes. But instead they're acknowledging that they will have to shake their foundations and they will have to change the kind of law that they have always implemented before, because law is not something that was specifically made for satisfying women and LGBTIQ persons' needs. No, it was actually done the other way around. So you have to have these institutions capable of implementing such recommendations. But the second dilemma that the Colombian case dissolved, and Adriana was just reminding me of that, was the relation that is established between sexual violence or gender-based violence and armed conflict. We are sadly seeing how, again, this lesson from the Colombian context can be proved right in many other contexts, like the martial law in South Korea just recently, and what we are discovering in the Syria context at the moment. There is no way to construct an argument or to build an argument around the difference between gender-based violence and armed conflict, since armed conflict is just a violent way to resolve an issue, and gender is an unresolved issue in most societies, then they do have a close connection. And it is not acceptable to say that gender-based violence crimes or sexual conflict-related sexual violence crimes are not part of what transitional or peace-building initiatives should be approaching or judicializing. I would like to also mention that none of this could have happened in the Colombian context without survivors, both research, testimony, and advocacy. We couldn't have done it. The information that survivors have is perhaps the only information that the Colombian institutions had in order to judicialize those cases, because law was not meant to provide, let's say, satisfaction for women and queer individuals. But my takeaway for this is, if you're trying to help and you're trying to build a transitional process, you have to come at it both ways. You have to both train legal professionals, as Adriana said, that they did it successfully, I would say, in the Bosnian context. You have to train these professionals so they can carry on strategic litigations and further implement access to justice in the more traditional way. But you also have to do from the start, as Dr. Faride was saying before, you have to start implementing training or tools for grassroots organizations to gather evidence. Because right now, what seems evident and obvious that everybody knows in society so they can survive the conflict they're enduring, in 10 years, when they are presenting this argument before a court that might not even be made out of nationals, the argument is not going to be so obvious. The argument of what color the clothing used to mean, or what geographical spaces in the city were addressed to one or the other actor, they are not going to mean the same, and they're not going to be as evident as they are today. So just to close with this, I'll say that you have to strengthen both grassroots organizations and survivors in a way that they can gather information, and you have to train professionals that are going to be able to link that information with the most relevant or the most up-to-date standards in both national and international legal spaces, because you don't know what kind of norms are going to be the ones that the transitional court is going to use in your context. If it's either the national penal code, for example, or if you're going to use the Rome statute. That is something you don't know. So you have to gather all of the information you can, and you have to train all of the professionals that you can. So when it comes to that, you can actually construct or build an argument that is gonna go a longer way in the courtroom.
Well, Susanna, thank you for that contribution of the transitional justice and peace processes and the underscoring of how important it is to have teams of professionals who are gathering this information from the survivors with other teams who are also using it to implement. I think that all important word implementation, it's often not there, and it needs to be there so much more, because good things happen. A great peace process gets adopted, an agreement is forthcoming, and then where's the implementation? So very good points. We're going to do a very quick round. We have very little time, and we want to move to the Q&A from the audience. So let me ask each of you just to give us one solid, actionable item that you would put forward. What is your call to action? You've all said so much. We've learned a great deal. But what is a fundamental call to action from your experience that we should hear today to the international community or to other activists in this arena? We'll start with you, Elisa.
I would say it's awareness and advocacy. But what's also important with Ukraine, that all conflict-related sexual violence crimes, it's not about just sexual violence crimes, it's about genocidal war. And it's part of the genocidal war. And what's important is that we overcome this status of victim. And we are not just these victims, like the silent suffering victims. We are fighting. And this kind of awareness should be not to help some weak person who are like dying, almost like dead, but somebody will continue to fight. And it's what important that what I gave example of this lectures of awareness in these villages and small towns, that we try to send this message to all people, that we are not weak victims, that we are fighters. And that's why I gave this example about this weapon, of the testimony is a weapon. And this is very important, because often I see in some articles about Ukraine, oh, poor Ukrainians, poor, and nobody says that actually they're strong people, they continue to fight, there is no light, where they're living after survive captivity, after survive sexual violence, after survive death of some of their friends and people from families, like in Kherson, like some of our members, and but they continue to live life, continue to fight, and to fight for justice also. So, and this is important to create this image of people who survived conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Faraday.
Well, in terms of calls for action, I will still invest on long-term support, breaking stigma in that way that we empower them and we treat them with dignity during the whole of our campaign. Amplifying the voice of survivors through community intervention, advocacy for justice, as well as reparation and documentation as a key element, I think needs to be still there. So those are my recommendations for all countries that are still facing a lot of challenges, have to address this wound, which is not easy to be addressed. I have to say, sometimes we discuss, and when I mentioned, because I saw it one question also in Q&A, Ambassador, it is so important to have in mind that trauma does not have limits. We cannot say with one project or with one intervention, we are done. We have to be there for long-term intervention if we want really to alleviate the suffering, not only from primary generation, but also to intergeneration trauma.
Thank you. Adriana?
In our experience in Bosnia, the heightened attention of the international community has been a decisive factor in advancing the most sensitive transitional justice processes. For instance, 1 decade ago, we were witnessing a shift in attention of domestic actors, especially prosecutors, toward CRSV, which has traditionally been regarded as a lesser crime. And it was, in fact, a direct result of the rising attention at that time of the international community towards this topic. And we are seeing it now happening also in Ukraine, with an intensive focus of the international community on addressing CRSV and supporting survivors, directly influencing positively processes within domestic authorities and institutions. Having said this, while also mindful of the fact that this is always a context-specific question, it is crucial that the international community keeps continuously and consistently supporting those processes on an international level and national level, through funding, through technical support, political support. It shall also keep issuing concrete guiding recommendations, and it should keep requesting from domestic authorities and international authorities through the use of various tools, including sanctions, to comply with relevant international norms, standards, and decisions. Another important factor which I mentioned is listening to voices of survivors and being guided by their priorities. In this regard, fostering cooperation with civil society organizations, including survivors groups, is crucial. Can be a crucial tool, because they may be a decisive factor in ensuring that transitional justice is not reduced to a technocratic exercise, and that the various steps taken and the various policies implemented and developed are survivor-centered and adjusted to the actual needs and situation of survivors.
Thank you so much. And Susanna.
Well, I would say that you have to document gender institutions. What it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman is changing, not only from city to city or from country to country, but day to day, week to week. What it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman is going to be the core of the litigation process 5 or 10 years from now on. So you have to document that now in order to remember it and then make your claim as legible as possible for the then judge. Things that seem right now evident or daily life kind of thing, the kind of clothing you wear, the kind of professions you can go into, where in the city you can be safe or feel safe. Those are the actual markers of gender that are going to be the ones that prove either systematicity or the attack against civil society that later on we're going to have to litigate.
Thank you. We have very little time left, but maybe we can get a couple of questions in quickly if you ask them quickly and we have short answers. Rebecca, can you give us some of the questions, please?
Yes. So one of the first questions that was submitted before is, are there mechanisms for ensuring accountability for sexual violence and conflict, the same for boys and men as for women and girls? And what about sexual minorities? And then I'll give a second question right now, including regarding reparations. So what are your views on the value of reparations that help rebuild at the community level and rehabilitate victims into their communities? Are there any lessons learned there?
Okay, good. Who wants to take either of those? Are there different mechanisms for accountability when it comes to male survivors against their perpetrators, and the whole question of reparations?
I can take on my first one, if it's okay.
Sure.
That is actually one of the lessons learned from the Colombian context. What happened was that the feminist movement and the queer movement came together in order to present a bigger and stronger argument about not providing amnesty for certain crimes that were aimed at harming the either gender identity, sexual orientation, or overall personal integrity of the victim based on their gender. So they sort of left the identity of the victim behind, and they came around a collective litigation strategy of not judicializing these crimes specifically, for example, as rape, but as gender persecution, which is an international crime that punishes the intention to discriminate a person based on several personal qualities. One of those is gender. And this has brought together men, boys, queer persons, women and girls who were subjected to all sorts of crimes, not only rape, but all sorts of crimes, from kidnappings to killings. But because what they do have in common is that they were motivated in the discrimination of their gender, because boys are not supposed to do that, or because women are supposed to marry boys, like that kind of discrimination that is broader than just what has been documented as rape against women and girls. And that is one of the strategies. It is not specific for men and queer people, it is for everyone, but that is how those movements came together in Colombia.
Alyssa.
Yeah, because we have this mechanism of reparations, and it's the same, it works in the same way for men and women. And I have to say that in Ukraine, since 2015, men first time started to give testimonies. And it's a big revolution in our society. It's a big change. And now we have also, like we have a SEMA Ukraine, it's a women organization, but we have alumni, which is a men organization of men survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. But one important thing that many men were, they went through specific sexual torture. It was a torture through genitals with electricity. And so now it's mainly these men who survived this kind of sexual torture. But we have the same mechanism, no difference.
Okay, well, go ahead, Dr. Faraday, and that will be the last word.
Yes, I think we need, more or less in all countries are same mechanism in place, but we have to express the sensitivity that men who are rape victims are going through. And in our organization, when men started to come, they were quite late in the process, because perhaps in our advocacy action, in our campaign, we mentioned women who are disproportionately impacted, but we never ever have to forget, because also men are part of this crime. And especially in patriarchal families, in societies, when expectation of man is to be stronger, to not be in a position of the victims, it is very hard for them to take the manhood for them. So what I would like to say as a recommendation, that in our advocacy action, in awareness raising, in court, we have to integrate also men as a part of this crime, because in certain society, they are not perceived as being sexual violence. And we also are aware that when we published the first book dedicated to the men unheard voices, there were even men from politician perspective who said even they are touched during the wartime. So it's not in a part of thinking. We have to challenge the gender dynamic of the war, and we have to create that space that also men have to feel equally supported as women, because sometimes for them it's harder to be in a position of the victims due to those expectations of society. And we had to use different strategies. You have to attract and create the space also for them, either to benefit reparation, either to be part of a justice process, as well as to testify and share the story.
And thank you to the questioner for bringing in that dimension of this discussion, its application to men and boys as well in terms of conflict-related sexual violence. I'm sorry we have to end here. There are so many more questions we would have liked to have gotten to, but I want to thank all of you who've joined us for this discussion, and particularly to thank the extraordinary panel, Alyssa, Dr. Faraday, Adriana, Susanna, who work every day on this issue and have so illuminated this discussion today. And also to DCM Dittman and the leadership of Germany, and to Jess Keller for outlining the report. We hope you will read the report, implement it, carry out its recommendations, and continue this work. Conflict-related sexual violence is a purposeful tool of war. It's time we really addressed it seriously for the crime that it is, ensured accountability, and ensure also survivor-centered care that, as you heard today, is comprehensive and long-term. There is much work to do. It requires a multi-pronged strategy, but we hope that this discussion will enable all of us to do a better job. So thank you on this Human Rights Day for joining us for this fundamental discussion on human rights. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a good day.